Hello, friends, and welcome to a brand new story. In this episode, I'll be telling you the tale of Henry, the human ambassador, and Ava, the alien woman. Grab your coffee and enjoy the story. I thought to myself, she looks so sexy. And the alien woman turned to me and said, I heard you, human. There is a particular flavor of briefing that governments give their envoys before sending them into rooms full of people who could end civilization with a poorly chosen fork. And Henry had endured all of it. He had sat through the 70-slide presentation on Thelari greeting protocols. He had memorized the difference between a bow that meant respect and a bow that meant come at me. He had practiced not staring at the crimson skin, the glowing eyes, the elegantly pointed ears, until he could look a Thelari in the face and think of absolutely nothing at all. That last part had felt important. The briefing had mentioned, in a single throwaway line buried between customs regulations and a warning about the shrimp, that the Thelari were touch-telepaths. Touch, as in contact, as in don't shake too many hands and you'll be fine. Henry had underlined the word touch twice and felt very prepared. He was not prepared. The reception hall aboard Meridian Station was the kind of room designed to make a person feel small in 3 separate directions at once. It curved upward into a dome of transparent alloy, beyond which the planet Thelari turned slowly, a marble of rust and violet cloud, while inside, hundreds of floating lanterns drifted at shoulder height like patient jellyfish, casting everyone in a warm, forgiving light that Henry did not deserve. Humans clustered on one side in their sensible dark suits, looking like a convention of apologetic accountants. The Thelari occupied the other, resplendent in flowing garments, the color of arterial blood and deep space, and moved with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once tripped over a rug in their lives. Henry had positioned himself near a pillar, holding a glass of something that glowed faintly blue and tasted like a forgery of blueberries, and had assigned himself one job for the evening: survive. Say nothing memorable. Shake no hands he didn't have to. Return to his quarters with the treaty unsabotaged and his career intact. He was, by his own generous estimate, doing beautifully. Then she walked across the room. He didn't know her name yet. He only knew that the entire hall seemed to reorganize itself around her passage, conversations bending in her direction like plants toward a window. Her skin caught the lantern light and held it, a deep and living crimson that made the human suits look even more like a funeral for spreadsheets. She moved without apparent effort, the long lines of her robe trailing a half-second behind her as though space itself were reluctant to let go, and her ears, those absurd, graceful, elven points, caught the glow at their tips. Her eyes, faintly luminous, swept the room with the mild interest of someone appraising a painting she'd already decided not to buy. And Henry, envoy of humanity, career diplomat, underliner of the word touch, thought, clearly, involuntarily, with the full, unguarded honesty of a man who believed himself entirely alone inside his own skull. She looks so sexy. Across the entire hall she went still. It was not a subtle stillness. It was the stillness of a needle finding true north, of a predator that has heard a twig snap 40 meters off. One moment she was gliding past a cluster of Thelari dignitaries. The next, she had stopped mid-step, and her head turned with a slow, deliberate precision that Henry felt in his stomach before his brain caught up. Her glowing eyes crossed the crowded room, past 100 bodies and a dozen drifting lanterns, and landed on him with the unerring accuracy of a targeting system that had never known a miss. Every survival instinct Henry possessed lit up at once and offered him a menu of useless options. Hide behind the pillar, sink into the floor, emigrate. He did none of these because his legs had unionized and gone on strike, and so he simply stood there, glowing blue drink in hand, as she changed course and came toward him. She did not hurry. That was the worst part. She crossed the hall with the same liquid grace, only now every one of those unhurried steps was aimed at him, and a small, knowing smile had begun to curve at the edge of her mouth, growing warmer and more amused with each meter she closed. Henry's mind, in a spectacular act of self-sabotage, chose this moment to announce loudly and repeatedly, "Do not think anything. Do not think anything. which was a bit like commanding a dropped plate not to shatter. She stopped in front of him. Up close she was, if anything, worse for his composure. Taller than he'd guessed, eyes the shade of banked embers and radiating an entirely unfair calm. "I heard you, human," she murmured, low enough that the words belonged to him alone. Henry's face performed the complete thermal history of a dying star in roughly 2 seconds. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had prepared remarks for 17 diplomatic scenarios, and not one of them began with your target audience receiving your inner monologue in high definition from across a ballroom. He waited, bracing for the cold turn, the offense, the incident that would end his career, and possibly the alliance in a single evening. Instead, she tilted her head, studying his mortified face with open, delighted curiosity, having plainly caught not just the thought, but the helpless sincerity underneath it. "Most people," she said, "try to hide what they feel about me." Her smile deepened. "You didn't even manage that." Henry woke the next morning with the specific dread of a man who remembers, in perfect chronological order, every stupid thing he did the night before. He lay very still on the narrow embassy bunk and stared at the ceiling of his quarters, where a small viewport offered a slice of Thelari turning below. And he told himself with great firmness that today would be different. Today he would be a professional. Today he would radiate a cool, unreadable competence, the kind of diplomatic gravity that made other envoys straighten their collars. Today he would keep his thoughts locked in a vault, behind another vault, at the bottom of a well. He rehearsed this resolution in the mirror while brushing his teeth, and it held, unbroken and magnificent, for approximately 4 minutes. It broke the moment he stepped into the negotiation antechamber and found her already there. She was seated at the long table with a data slate glowing in front of her, morning light from the dome falling across her crimson skin, and she looked up at him with an expression of such immediate, unrepentant amusement that his carefully constructed vault collapsed like a souffle in an airlock. He thought reflexively, "Oh no, she's here," and then, catastrophically, aware of the thought and unable to stop it, "Don't think about last night. Do not think about—" and her eyebrow rose a precise, devastating millimeter. "You haven't touched me," she observed pleasantly, "so I can't hear that one. But your face, human, is doing all the work your thoughts usually do." "Henry," he managed. "My name is Henry, in case that comes up, during the, diplomacy." "I know your name." She gestured to the chair across from her. "I made a point of learning it after last night. It seemed only fair given how thoroughly I already know your opinions." He sat down, mostly because his knees suggested it. Up close and by daylight, without a room full of lanterns to blame, she was simply and infuriatingly composed, and Henry understood with a sinking certainty that he had been assigned to work with her, the two of them, human envoy and Thelari emissary, side by side across a table that suddenly felt about 8 inches wide. Her name, she told him, was Ava. She said it the way one lays down a card one is fairly sure will win. The stakes, at least, were sobering enough to steady him. Over the next hour, as aides filtered in and the real business began, Henry relearned why any of them were here at all. It was not ceremony. 3 months ago, deep-range Thelari observers had detected something drifting in from the dark between systems, a vast, silent cluster of derelict ships, thousands of them, ancient and dead and utterly without transmission. The Quiet Fleet, someone had named it, and the name had stuck because it was accurate and because accurate things are frightening. It had no course anyone could explain, no engines anyone could detect, and it was drifting, with the patience of geology, directly toward the narrow stretch of space that both humanity and Thelari called home. Neither civilization had the ships, the sensors, or the sheer nerve to meet it alone. Hence the treaty, hence the reception, the lanterns, the shrimp, and Henry. "So you see," Ava said, folding her hands, "we are attempting to build the foundations of an alliance capable of facing an unknown existential threat, and the human delegation has sent me a man who cannot keep a single thought inside his own head." "In fairness," Henry said, "no one told me your range was the entire building." The briefing said touch, I underlined it. Twice. Your briefing was written by someone who has never met a far listener. She said it lightly, but something flickered behind the words, gone before he could name it. Most Thelari must touch. I am an exception. Before he could pursue that, the door opened for the two people Henry would come to think of as the evening's other main problem. First was Oliver, the human trade attaché, a smooth and gleaming man who wore his smile like a well-tailored jacket, and who shook Henry's hand a beat too long while saying how marvelous, how simply marvelous it was to have such a promising young envoy on the file. A sentence that Henry, even without telepathy, could tell meant I have already decided you are useful to me. Oliver, it was widely and quietly known, made his fortune on the frictions between worlds, and an alliance that erased those frictions was, for him, a personal catastrophe dressed as a triumph. Second was Elena, a Thelari elder of considerable rank and evidently zero patience. Her crimson skin faded to the pale rose of great age, her pointed ears hung with rings that chimed faintly when she moved. She took her seat, looked at the humans the way one looks at a stain on good furniture, and said, to no one in particular, I have lived 400 years without needing these creatures. I fail to see why I should begin now. Ava's jaw tightened by a fraction. Henry, sensing an opportunity to be diplomatic, drew breath to say something soothing and statesmanlike. Don't, Ava murmured, without looking at him. I can feel you winding up to it from here. Whatever it is, it will make things worse. She was, annoyingly, correct. He closed his mouth. Across the table, Oliver beamed. Elena scowled. The quiet fleet drifted silently closer through the dark, and Henry thought, with a clarity he immediately regretted, this is going to be a very long treaty. Ava's mouth twitched. Yes, she said. It is. The thing about a mystery is that it will not leave you alone once it has decided you are interesting, and Henry's mystery had decided precisely that. He tried to file it under Not My Problem alongside the shrimp and Oliver's teeth, but it kept surfacing at inconvenient moments, usually while he was pretending to read defense schematics. The briefing had said touch. The Thelari themselves, when he'd carefully asked an aide, had confirmed touch. The gift ran through skin, hand to hand, a private thing, close and deliberate. And yet a woman had plucked a single thought out of his skull from clear across a crowded ballroom, through 100 bodies and a small navy of floating lanterns, with the casual accuracy of someone catching a dropped coin. That was not touch. That was something else entirely, and no one wanted to talk about it, which of course only made him want to talk about it more. He got his chance 3 nights later when the day's talks had ground themselves into exhausted stalemate and everyone with sense had gone to bed. Henry, who had never once possessed sense, was still in the star chart room, frowning at a projection of the quiet fleet that hung in the air like a slow-motion snowstorm made of tombs. Ava found him there. She had a way of arriving in a room that skipped the part where a door opened. One moment he was alone. The next she was beside him, studying the drift of dead ships with him. You're troubled, she said. I don't need to touch you to see that. You frown with your whole body. It's very inefficient. I've been thinking, Henry said, and then, catching himself, which I realize is a dangerous confession to make to you specifically. The corner of her mouth moved. Go on. Touch. Everyone keeps telling me your people need touch. But you heard me from across the entire hall. That's not touch, Ava. I don't know what that is. Broadcast reception. So either the whole galaxy is lying to me, which, given my week, feels plausible, or you're not quite like the others. For a long moment she said nothing, and the light of the projected fleet moved over her face in slow, pale washes. When she finally spoke, the practiced ease had gone out of her voice, and what was left underneath was quieter and much more careful. You're right, she said. Most Thelari must touch, hand to hand, skin to skin. It is intimate, and it is bounded, and it is safe. You choose whom you open to, and the moment you let go, the door closes. She lifted one crimson hand and turned it, studying her own fingers as though they belonged to someone else. I have no door. I hear at distance, whether I wish to or not. In a quiet room, I hear one mind. In a crowd, I hear the loud ones, the frightened, the furious, the ones who feel too much to contain it. She glanced at him sidelong. You, for instance, are extremely loud. That's the nicest way anyone has ever insulted me. It wasn't entirely an insult. She looked back at the fleet. Among my own people, a far listener is an unsettling thing. No one can hide from her. No polite fiction survives in her presence, so they keep me at the edges. Useful when a negotiation needs a lie detector at the table, but not close. Never close. You do not invite the woman who hears everything to sit at your fire. She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it land harder. Elena, for all her charm, at least dislikes me honestly. I find that restful. Henry, who had spent his whole life feeling faintly too much and saying faintly too much and being told to please, for the love of God, dial it down, felt something turn over in his chest. So you spend your life in rooms full of people, he said slowly, and you're the loneliest person in every one of them, because you're the only one who can't pretend. Ava went very still. It was, he realized, the second time he'd made her go still, and this stillness was different, softer, more startled, the stillness of someone who has been seen from an angle they didn't know was exposed. Most people, she said at last, find the gift frightening. They think about what I might take. They don't think about what it costs to carry. She studied him with those banked ember eyes. You are a very strange envoy, Henry. I've been told, repeatedly, in a briefing, with slides. She almost laughed. He saw it get most of the way to her mouth before she wrestled it back down. And for a moment, the treaty and the fleet and the 8-inch table between them all seemed very far away, and the two of them were simply two people who had each spent too long being too much for everyone around them, standing in the dark, being exactly enough for each other. Which was naturally, when the projection stuttered. Henry frowned. The fleet's drift vector, the number they'd been building 3 days of talks around, flickered and changed. Just slightly. Just enough. He leaned in, and cold moved down his spine. Ava, that number's wrong. That's not the figure we logged this morning. Ava's warmth vanished like a snuffed lantern. She stepped to the console, hands moving fast, and the readout confirmed it. Someone had reached into the shared archive and quietly altered the data both delegations were negotiating on. Falsified. Recently. From inside. This wasn't a glitch, she said softly. Her eyes came up to his, and they were no longer warm at all. Someone is trying to break this alliance from within. And Henry. She hesitated, which frightened him more than anything yet. The edit was logged under a human access key. Yours. The accusation arrived the next morning with the efficiency of a thing that had been prepared well in advance. Henry had barely finished not sleeping when the summons came, and he walked into the great negotiation hall to find it arranged less like a meeting and more like a tribunal. The human delegation on one side wearing expressions of preemptive distancing, the Thelari on the other in cold formal rows, and Elena at the center of it all, her rings chiming softly as she folded her hands with the satisfaction of a woman whose worst opinions have just been confirmed. The evidence is not ambiguous, Elena said, and her voice carried without effort through the domed room. The quiet fleet data was altered. Thelari defense corridors, the very approach vectors we would use to meet the threat, were copied and moved to an external cache. Both actions were performed under a single human access key. She let the pause stretch. That key belongs to the envoy Henry. Henry opened his mouth to say the obvious thing, which was that he would have to be the single stupidest saboteur in the history of espionage to commit treason under his own name, and then thought better of leading with an argument that hinged on his intelligence. I didn't do this, he said instead, which was true, and he knew even as he said it, worth precisely nothing in a room where everyone had already decided. Oliver rose smoothly from the human benches, radiating regret like cologne. "Nobody wants to believe it," he said, laying a warm, betraying hand on Henry's shoulder. "I've worked with the young man, but we can't let personal feeling cloud what the records plainly show. The alliance is bigger than any one of us." He squeezed. "I'm so sorry, Henry." And Henry, staring at that manicured hand, understood with sick clarity that the sympathy was the knife, and that he'd been chosen for this precisely because he was junior, over-honest, and easy to hang. The hall began, in its cold, procedural way, to close around him. He could feel the treaty going with him. 3 delegations worth of momentum reversing. Elena's isolationists gathering strength with every murmur. The whole fragile bridge between 2 worlds cracking down its center because one man's name had been written where it shouldn't be. He looked, without meaning to, across the room to Ava. She was watching him, and whatever she saw in his face, or heard in the loud, undefended broadcast of his panic, made her come to a decision he would not fully understand until later. She stood. "He is telling the truth," Ava said. Elena turned her faded eyes on her. "You cannot know that. You have not touched him." "Then I will." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Henry watched confusion ripple through the Thelari benches, watched Elena's composure fracture for the first time. He didn't yet grasp what she was offering, but he understood from the reaction around them that it was enormous. That among a people for whom the mind was the most private thing that existed, for a far listener to deliberately, publicly open herself to another mind, to touch a human's thoughts in front of the entire court, and stake her word on what she found there, was something close to scandalous. It exposed her. It marked her as compromised, biased, too close. It was, he realized, the exact opposite of the careful distance she had spent her whole life maintaining, the fire she was never invited to sit beside, and she was walking into it in front of everyone, for him. "Ava," he said quietly, "don't. Not for me. They'll never trust your read again." "I know," she said, crossing the floor. "Try not to think anything embarrassing. Though I've met you, so I'm not optimistic." She stopped in front of him and took his hand. He had wondered distantly what it would feel like. It felt like nothing and everything at once. A warmth that started at his palm and moved inward. And then the strange sensation of not being alone in his own skull. Of another presence standing quietly in a room he'd always had to himself. She did not rummage. She simply stood there in his mind with him, in the small, honest center of it, and he let her see the truth. "I didn't do this. I don't even know how. I would never break this thing, please." And beneath it, unhidden because he had never once managed to hide anything from her, the rest of it. The 3 nights of star charts. The way the loneliest woman in every room had somehow become the only person he wanted to stand beside. Ava's breath caught just slightly. Then she let go and turned to the hall, and her voice was steady as stone. "He did not do this. I have been in his mind, and I would stake my name on it. I am staking it now, before all of you. The key was used. Henry did not use it, which means someone in this room copied a human voice access, altered our shared data, and moved our defense corridors into a cache they can reach later." Her glowing gaze swept the benches, cold and deliberate, and lingered, just a beat too long to be accidental, on Oliver, whose smile did not move at all, which was itself the most damning thing about it. The saboteur is not the human standing accused. The saboteur is still sitting comfortably among us. It bought them the room's silence. It did not buy them safety. Henry could see Elena already marshalling doubt, could see the machinery grinding toward recess and further review, and he knew with a diplomat's instinct that by the time any tribunal convened, the real evidence in that external cache would be gone, and he would be the tidiest available answer. "We have until they reconvene," Ava murmured, close to his ear, under the rising noise. "After that, my word won't be enough. We need to find the cache before it's emptied, which means you and I are about to do something extremely against protocol." "Off the record, just us?" "Just us." Henry considered the fact that he was apparently, about to commit several genuine crimes in the company of a woman who could hear every panicked thought he had about it. "Wonderful," he said. "I've always wanted a co-conspirator who knows I'm lying before I do." They ran the cache to ground in the station's underlevels, in a maintenance sublayer where the lanterns gave way to humming coolant pipes, and the dome's grandeur curdled into honest industrial grime. Ava led. Henry followed, narrating his own anxiety loudly enough that she eventually said, without turning, "If you think the phrase 'we're going to die down here' one more time, I'm going to leave you for the pipes." The external cache was tucked into a dormant relay node, and when Ava's fingers coaxed it open, the truth spilled out in cold, readable lines, and it was worse and stupider than either of them had guessed. 2 hands had built this. That was the thing that stopped Henry cold. Not one saboteur, but 2, working the same machine from opposite ends, each certain they were the one using the other. The financial trail belonged to Oliver, a lattice of shell arrangements and prepositioned trades that would ripen into a personal fortune the instant the alliance collapsed and the old profitable frictions came roaring back. But the defense corridors, the copied approach vectors, the deep archival access no human key could truly reach on its own, that was Thelari work. That was Elena. She hadn't wanted money. She'd wanted the alliance dead, so her people would stay sealed away, pure and separate, exactly as they'd been for 400 years, and she had been willing to strip her own civilization's defenses bare to do it. She copied our corridors so the isolationists could argue the alliance was already leaking secrets. Ava said softly, reading faster than Henry could. "Prove humans can't be trusted with them. Force us back behind our own borders." Her jaw tightened. She'd rather we face the quiet fleet alone and blind than admit we need anyone. "And Oliver gave her the human key to frame me," Henry said, "so the leak would look like ours, not hers. 2 people who despise each other, holding hands to burn down the same house." He exhaled. "I almost admire it. It's a beautiful piece of mutual assured stupidity." "Admire it later. We have to reach the hall before the tribunal convenes, or your name is the answer everyone accepts." Ava was already copying the whole cache to a slate, and then she froze, her head coming up the way it had that first night across the ballroom. "Henry." "What?" "The fleet." Her voice had gone very quiet. "I've been so focused on the room that I stopped listening past it. But there's something out there. Not silent. I thought the quiet fleet was dead. It isn't quiet because it's dead. It's quiet because it's waiting, and it noticed us." Her eyes found his, wide and lit. "It's not drifting anymore, Henry. It's arriving. Now." They made the hall as the alarms began. What followed was the kind of hour that treaties are actually made of, as opposed to the kind with lanterns and shrimp. The quiet fleet came out of the dark, not as a snowstorm of tombs, but as something vast and half-woken. Thousands of ancient hulls turning their blind faces toward the little station that had, at last, made enough noise to be worth answering. And the defense corridors that both civilizations needed to coordinate a response were exactly the ones Elena had corrupted and copied and moved. Human sensors couldn't see the approach vectors. Thelari ships couldn't share targeting data through the poisoned archive. The 2 fleets, arriving in orbit to save everyone, were about to blunder into each other and the derelicts blind, in the dark, because 2 proud people had spent months sabotaging the one thing that would let them see. And this, finally, was where Henry's single ruinous liability became the only tool in the room that worked. Because when he burst into the command hall and threw the cache slate onto the central table and shouted the truth, Elena did what people like Elena always do. She denied it, smoothly, with 4 centuries of practiced dignity, and Oliver backed her with that marvelous, marvelous regret, and it was 2 liars' word against 1 disgraced envoy's. And it should have worked. It would have worked, except the hall was full of Thelari, and in the middle of it stood a human who had never in his life managed to hide a single thought, and who now stood in front of all of them, and simply, helplessly, broadcast the truth as loudly as he had once broadcast. She looked so sexy. Every line of the cache, every trade, every corridor, the whole shape of it, undefended and blazing and impossible to fake. because a mind that cannot lie cannot fake sincerity either. The far listeners in the room felt it hit like sunrise. And beside the loud, clean honesty of him, Elena's careful denials and Oliver's practiced regret curdled into exactly what they were. Because the one thing you cannot do in a room full of touch-telepaths, standing next to the loudest honest mind on the station, is lie by comparison. "Restore the corridors," Ava said into the ringing silence. And this time no one argued because Henry's transparent panic had already told them what was true. Now, both fleets, together or not at all. They did it together. There was no time to be graceful about it. Human sensors feeding raw into Thelari targeting. Thelari corridor maps flung open to human pilots. Two civilizations trusting each other in real time at gunpoint because the alternative was extinction, which turned out to be a remarkably effective negotiating position. The quiet fleet, met at last by something coordinated and awake, found the little station a far harder thing to swallow than it had expected. And in the middle of the chaos, Elena's rings chiming as guards took her arm, and Oliver's marvelous smile finally, at last, falling off his face, Henry caught Ava's eye across the command hall and thought, with total helpless clarity, we might actually survive this. "Yes," she said, and for the first time her smile reached all the way. "I heard you." The quiet fleet, it turned out, had never wanted to destroy anyone. That was the strange grace note at the end of all the terror. Once the two civilizations stopped nearly killing each other long enough to actually look, the ancient hulls resolved into something no one had guessed. A slow migration of derelicts driven ahead of a dying star, the last drifting remnant of a people who had gone silent thousands of years before either humanity or Thelari had learned to build a ship. Not a fleet, a funeral procession. It had woken and turned toward Meridian for the simplest reason in the galaxy. After millennia of drifting through the dark, it had finally heard something loud enough to be worth answering, and the loudest thing in that quadrant of space, as ever, was Henry's undefended mind. Ava enjoyed pointing this out. She pointed it out often. "You didn't just start an alliance," she told him. "You flagged down a graveyard from several light years away, with your feelings." He accepted this with as much dignity as the situation allowed, which was none. The aftermath sorted itself with satisfying finality. Oliver's beautiful lattice of shell trades, so carefully built to ripen on the Alliance's corpse, curdled instead into a very thorough evidence file, and the man who had squeezed Henry's shoulder with such marvelous regret was escorted off Meridian to face a human tribunal that felt no regret whatsoever. Elena was harder and sadder. She did not go quietly, exactly, but she went, 400 years of pride finally cracking not into repentance, but into something quieter, a bewildered old woman watching the sealed and separate world she'd bled to protect choose, in the end, not to be sealed at all. Her isolationists lost their argument the moment the two fleets flew a corridor together and lived. You cannot warn people against needing each other after they have watched needing each other save their lives. The treaty was signed the following week, and it was signed by a chastened Thelari council and a vindicated human envoy, and there were, mercifully, no lanterns. There was one more piece of business, and it belonged to Ava. She had staked her name in that hall, opened her mind to a human in front of her entire court, marked herself compromised, biased, too close, done the one thing a far listener was never supposed to do. Henry had assumed it would cost her everything. It did the opposite. Because when the truth came out, the court understood what her read had actually been. Not the compromised judgment of a woman too close to a man, but the one clear signal in a room full of expensive lies. The gift they had kept at the edges of every fire had, at the decisive moment, been the only thing that could tell honesty from performance and save them all. They stopped seating her at the edges. A people who had spent generations treating a far listener as an unsettling necessity discovered all at once that the woman who could not be lied to and could not lie was the single most valuable diplomat either civilization possessed, not a lie detector to be wheeled out and put away, but the bridge itself, The one mind at the table that both sides could trust precisely because it could hide nothing. The loneliest person in every room was, abruptly, invited to sit at every fire. Henry watched her navigate this with visible suspicion, like a cat presented with an unexpectedly warm windowsill. "You look like you're waiting for it to be a trap," he said. They were standing under the dome again, Thelari turning below in its rust and violet, the hall behind them full of people who now, remarkably, wanted her there. "I have spent my whole life being the thing people flinch from," Ava said. "Forgive me if I don't trust the windowsill immediately. Take your time. I'll be here being loud about it in the meantime." And that was the thing that had changed in him, though he only half noticed it. The man who had arrived on Meridian with a single job, survive, say nothing memorable, keep every thought in a vault behind a vault at the bottom of a well, had somehow become a man whose transparent, unhideable honesty was the reason two civilizations were still breathing. He had spent his whole life being told to dial it down, to be less, to please, for the love of God, stop feeling so audibly. He had come to a station full of telepaths, the worst possible place for a man who couldn't hide, and discovered that the thing everyone had wanted him to bury was the only thing in the room that couldn't be faked. He wasn't too much. He had, it turned out, been exactly enough all along. He'd simply needed to stand in a room full of people who could hear it. "You're doing the loud thinking again," Ava observed. "I can feel it from here. Something sentimental. Something about being enough. You could pretend not to hear that." "I could." She turned to face him fully, crimson skin catching the light of the turning planet, pointed ears tipped in gold, the banked embers of her eyes warm all the way through. "But you never once pretended anything for me. Not from the first stupid thought you ever had in a crowded room. Do you know how rare that is, human? A mind I never have to wonder about? I've been told it's a character flaw. There were slides. It's the reason I'm still standing here." She stepped closer, and the 8 inches that had once felt like a chasm closed to nothing at all. "So, go on. I know you're about to think something outrageous. I can feel you winding up to it. You've been winding up to it since the reception." Henry looked at her, at the woman who had been alone in every room, who had opened her most private self in front of her whole world to save a man who couldn't keep a secret, who could hear the loudest and quietest corners of his mind and had decided, against all sense, to stay. And this time, entirely on purpose, with no vault and no well and nothing hidden anywhere, he thought it, clear and warm and just for her. "I am completely, hopelessly in love with you, and you look so sexy, and I'm never going to stop being loud about either one." Ava went still. Then she smiled the whole way and leaned in until her lips nearly brushed his ear. "I heard you, human. We spend our whole lives learning to hide. We build the vaults behind the vaults. We practice the calm face. We dial ourselves down until we're quiet enough to be acceptable. And somewhere along the way we start to believe that the parts we bury are the parts that would have gotten us hurt. But Henry couldn't hide. Not one thought. Not from the very first. And in the one place where that should have destroyed him, a room full of people who could hear everything, it turned out to be the only thing worth trusting. The loneliest woman in every room stayed, not because he flattered her better than anyone else, but because he was the single mind she never had to wonder about. So maybe the question isn't how much of yourself you can keep hidden. Maybe it's this: who might have stayed if you'd let them hear the loud, unguarded, embarrassing truth of you? How many rooms have you sat in, dialed all the way down, certain you were too much, when the right person was waiting to find out you were exactly enough? We flinch from being known. We call it protection. But everyone Henry ever loved, he loved out loud. And in the end, across the dark, something answered. What would answer you if you finally let yourself be heard? The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Ava and Henry's story. Please show your appreciation by pressing the like button, leaving your thoughts on the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you in another science fiction story. Goodbye.